immense pleasure in welcoming you to our annual department festival, Ecclesia 2021. Ecclesia is intended to engage students in an exciting conversation about politics and society that entrenches deep in their lives. It is a two-way exchange where academicians and experts from different spheres assist the students in understanding the nuances of issues at hand, and where the students outshine their creativity into birthing a fresh perspective. The theme for this year is Parivartan, Reforming India, a Public Policy Perspective. The year 2020, as we know, stands testimony to one of the most unanticipated, unprecedented, and sudden change in multifaceted spheres. Years in transition, with COVID being the climax, does make us all question, how does public policy form and reform nations? Does the turn of events and aspirations post-COVID ask for parivartan? Do our policy priorities need to change? With this vision in mind, we've tried to put together a cohort of eminent personalities from respective fields to help the attendees gauge an insight into how policies shape nations. We all would agree that a large section of India today is brimming with the youth. However, we see an evident lack of representation of this part of society in avenues of decision making. This does raise a pivotal question. Where do we place the youth when we study the public policy discourse? Where is our youth when we are talking about decision making, when we are talking about governance? Public policies are often needed to address society's most urgent issues, where the market has failed, for example, or looking at where public goods need to be produced, or maybe looking at where the society needs to allocate its resources, or where we need to take collective action. And we believe that for the success of any public policy, capitalizing on the youth and extending the discourse of policy making, the power of decision making to them would be one major driver toward achieving this intention. It is our immense pleasure to have with us Mr. Anil Swarup, sir, for our inaugural session on youth in public policy, innovation and inclusion. Before we begin, I'd like to invite Dr. Namrata Singh, ma'am, teacher in charge, Department of Political Science, to kindly share a few words with all the attendees. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Deepshikha. And your inaugural wordings were clear of the angst of the youth in this public policy. Thank you so much. I take this opportunity on behalf of Department of Political Science to extend a big warm welcome to everyone to Ecclesia 2020. I take this opportunity to welcome our esteemed speaker, Anil Swarup sir, and our principal ma'am, Dr. Vijayalakshmi Nanda, who is our strength, our mentor, and our guide. And I have to really welcome the true epitome of our department, that is our students. Department of Political Science has always worked towards familiarizing students with conceptual and applied essence of our discipline. Ecclesia, over the years, is a testimony of that. We have discussed and delved on issues and challenges facing our democracy, whether it be right to information, language, ethics, governance, democracy, social exclusion, or rights in contemporary India. The attempt has always been to have an insightful and sensitive reflections on issues of Indian and global politics and deeply felt human sentiments. We have been graced by dignitaries, including Honorable Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, Srimati Sheila Dikshit, Shri Arvind Kejriwal, Jagmati Sangwan, Anupma Roy, Swapan Das Gupta, Professor Neera Chando, Professor Manoranjan Mohanty, just to name a few. The students have been active learners throughout the years, learning from within the class to such endeavors like Ecclesia to go beyond the walls. We believe in not about being, but by doing. Miranda House is one such creative space where students are not only trained in the best intellectual traditions of knowledge, but also in the spirit of democracy. This year, Ecclesia, Parivartan Reforming in India, a public policy perspective, is based on the mantra that let's share the responsibility and opportunity to create a better world. Let's put our best foot forward by learning from the best in the field, putting our theoretical knowledge to the exposition of the practicalities that is there. With these words, I welcome our principal ma'am and request her to kindly open Ecclesia and share a few words with us. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Singh, Namrata Singh, and I think congratulations to the students for opening this particular ecclesia with such a bang. We are indeed delighted and honored to receive, to welcome Dr. Anil Swarup here. I wish it was in the college. We would have welcomed you with our mug, with the college mug and our planter. But we are not able to do that. But you are aware of the college and you know the precedents of the college and the legacy of the college. These are young women who are leading the program. I agree with Namrata that our guests of honor today are not just you, but within the program, the ones with ownership. I think the ecclesia is by the students, for the students, and of the students. So in that light, I would like to, open the ecclesia and a few words about our guest here. It's important to do that, Deepshikha and Bhumika, although I do not have that mandate. But I would like to say, sir, that I have read your books. And especially when, as a political science, I would like to say that I'm a political science learner. So in that sense, I've looked at the ethical dilemmas and also not just a civil servant, but these are all aspiring civil servants here with you. And your ethical dilemmas, the book on ethical dilemmas of a civil servant and not just a civil servant, are interesting for us to read as leaders. So I think as leaders or academic, you can say, how can you be followers? What are the ethical dilemmas when there is no legal framework to look at it? I think those are interesting learnings. I would recommend those books to our students, because like Gurcharan Das says, that is a book that everybody should read, especially if one wants to be a civil servant or if one is a civil servant. And I would add to that, even if one is not a civil servant, because ultimately the point of governance is that. The point of governance is to learn how to be the best and how to serve the people. So I would like to say, sir, that we are indeed honored to have you here. Our students will learn so much, but more than the students, even the teachers, the faculty members, and I, as the acting principal of the college and an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, feel extremely privileged and honored to receive you. So please, over to the organizers, and I'm here only to listen, so I will keep my time to this. And again, I open the ecclesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vijayalakshmi Nanda ma'am. It is my honor to introduce to you the keynote speaker for today's session, Anil Swarup sir. During his career spanning 38 years, Anil Swarup sir attempted to make it happen. Born in Allahabad, Uttar Pradesh, he earned his master's degree in political science from Allahabad University in 1978, where he was also awarded the Chancellor's Gold Medal for being the best all-round student. Before joining the Indian Administrative Service in 1981, he served the Indian Police Service for a year. He won the Director's Gold Medal for the Best Officer Trainee at the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration amongst the officers of his batch. As a civil servant, he held various assignments within both the state and central government. During the final years of his career, he served as Secretary to Government of India in the Ministry of Coal, where he handled the aftermath of the coal scam. Thereafter, he served as Secretary, School Education and Literacy, where he attempted to foster public-private partnerships to improve the quality of school education. As a strategic thinker and an innovative leader, he won several awards and nominations, the prominent ones being nominated as one of the policy change agents by the Economics Times during the years 2010, 2012, 2015, and 2016. He was selected as one of the 35 action heroes in India Today's 35th annual edition. He is the founder chairman of Nexus of Good, an initiative towards recognizing positive action and providing inspiration to society at large to replicate them. He's also the author of the bestseller, Not Just a Civil Servant. Sir, it is an honor to have you with us today. Over to you.
Please unmute, sir.
Thank you very much, Sri Lakshmi, for those very, very kind words. I feel truly humbled. And a special thank to Madam Principal Vijay Lakshmi ji. I'm so glad that you've read these two books, because it makes my task that much easier to communicate with you, because you would know the background from where I come from. More than anything else, I enjoyed every moment of my existence as a civil servant. In fact, in the first book I write, that I became an IAS officer because my dad wanted me to become an IAS officer. It was his dream, and I made that dream into my dream and tried to fulfill it. But at the end of those 38 years, I write in the last chapter of that book that if I were to be born again, I'd like to be an IAS officer all over. For the simple reason, the amount of potential that you have to serve the poorest of the poor, the helpless of the helpless, that the potential that the IAS has, I don't see any other service having that. It is not to say that you can't serve the people outside of the IAS. But since I have that experience, I can talk about it. What I'll try and do today is to briefly take you through how policies and schemes are formulated in the government, not to say that that is how they should be, but that's how they are. And then see what role can you all play. To me, the second part would be very important, because I do about 2 to 3 webinars every day and talk to people like you, to bright students like you. I love talking to them because I get a lot of energy from people like you. I learn a lot from people like you. I'm still a learner. So interacting with you helps me a lot. So I look forward to this interaction. I would suggest that I speak for about 30-35 minutes and then maybe spend more time interacting with you all. So if that is okay with you, I can start my presentation. It's not a formal presentation. It's more of a chat, but I would rather spend more time interacting with you than a one-way traffic of my telling you what I have to say. Now, how is a policy formulated in the government? I'll give you an example, and through that example, I'll lead you through how a policy gets formulated. And the latest example of policy formulation is the National Education Policy, which was announced last year. Now, this policy formulation took almost 6 years to get formulated. First, a committee was constituted under the chairmanship of late Mr. T.S.R. Subramaniam, and then another committee was constituted, and both these committees together finally came up with a draft that was announced in 2020. Now, typically what happens in a policy formulation is that government constitutes a committee that engages with various stakeholders. There are experts in the committee. They come up with a document. My experience with such documents is, and I've had experience with a large number of policies in the government, the better the document, the lesser it is implemented, like life. You know, it's easier to talk about what is there, what needs to be done, what should be done, rather than making it happen. I spent my lifetime, at least those 38 years in the government, to make things happen. So I used to wonder, why do we spend so much time on policy formulation? And from here, I'll try to bring in your role in policy formulation. First, in the formulation of the policy, like the National Education Policy, I was shocked to see, at that point in time, I was secretary in the Education Department. And though I did not have any role to play in the setting up of those committees that ultimately formulated that policy, but when I saw the committee, I was shocked to see there was not a single practitioner on that committee. We didn't have a teacher, we didn't have a professor, we didn't have a principal. We had no such person who knew where the shoe pinches, and the policy was actually formulated by experts. Consequently, what happened was, we have an absolutely amazing policy which can hardly be faulted on any front. In fact, it is one of the finest documents in school and higher education. But that's the tragedy of it. Since it's so fine, I have my serious apprehension that it will be implemented. Now, let me explain this part, because this is very important. As some of you in future may get associated with the formulation of policies, I would believe that the following things have to be kept in mind. Now, it's very easy to have ideas in this country. You know, I'm so glad you're organizing this program where people are trying to discuss what needs to be done. But in India, there is no dearth of ideas, actually. The problem is with practicable and doable ideas. For an idea to fructify, and listen to this very carefully, though it might appear a bit more cumbersome, but that's the fact of life. For an idea to fructify in a democracy, It has to be politically acceptable, socially desirable, technologically feasible, financially viable, administratively doable, judicially tenable. And I've added the seventh dimension, which is emotionally relatable. And this came up very recently in the wake of Farmer's Law. Now, why am I telling you youngsters this? This because it's good to discuss ideas. We should, in fact. Revolutions have come through new ideas. But you must also look at the practicality, the doability of that idea. Now, let me briefly touch upon these 7 dimensions for you to understand that whenever you get an opportunity to intervene, first of all, let me digress a bit to delve upon this issue of the role of youngsters in policy formulation. And I will go into the details later on when I talk about what you can do to society. But in terms of policy formulation, I would suggest that don't be too worried about what the policies are emerging, because my experience in the government tells me that policies as such do not make much of a difference. It's the execution part that makes a difference. In any case, let me tell you, even as a civil servant, my contribution in policy making came after I had put in more than 20 years of service. So policy formulation at best at your level can provide inputs to the policy formulation, to provide feedback to the policy makers in terms of what is the ground reality, since you are in touch with the ground reality. Beyond it, formulation of policies, I don't think as students you have much of a role. But later on in your careers, whether you're in the private or the public sector, you can contribute, but there again, your contribution in policy formulation. No, we can normatively say that everyone should participate in policy formulation. Practically, that is not possible. You can at best provide inputs for policy formulation. So coming back to the constraints, because to me, the problem in this country is not with policies. In fact, we've had the finest of policies. The problem is in implementation. I recall when Dr. Kasturi Rangan, who was the chairman of the second committee of National Education Policy, when he came over and met me, I was then, as I said, Secretary Education. He asked me, do you have any suggestions for policy formulation? He was a bit shocked at my response. I told him, you are wasting your time. He looked at me, you all have set up this committee and you are saying that I'm wasting my time. I said that I have no problem with policy. We should have a policy. What is a policy? Policy is actually outlining and articulating intention of the government in a more organized manner. Beyond it, it defines the contours within which government has to act. Fact of the matter is, policy itself is not even legally, it cannot be enforced. It's just an intention of the government. This is not to say that intention is not important. This is not to say that policy is not required. But unfortunately, we stop at policy. Why? I've tried to understand the cause of every problem in this country in order to solve it. Time permitting, I'll give some other examples to explain to you why this approach of understanding the why of a problem is important in terms of finding a resolution. So I tried to find out why is this obsession for policy in this country? Because we are obsessed with headlines of the newspapers. When a policy gets announced, everyone is attending to it, discussing it. I must give you an example. When this education policy came, I got a call from the editor of Hindustan Times. And they asked me to write a 800-word piece on the national education policy. I said, I'll write it. But what came next surprised me. She said, we'll pay you 20,000 rupees for this. I said, I've never got so much per word ever in my entire life for writing an article, and you paying me 20,000 rupees. So it gave me a bit of an employment post-retirement, because many like me got employment as a consequence of this policy. Policy will happen or not, that I'll come to later on. But policy generates a lot of discussion, and that does not lead to much in this particular case. So until unless there is a clear-cut action plan, that's what I told Dr. Kasturi Rangan. Along with the policy, you must have a clear-cut, well-defined action plan outlining what needs to be done, how it will be done, who will do it, by when it will be done. This is extremely important, because when a policy, one who's suggesting a policy and one who's making a policy gets down to brass tacks of its implementation, then perhaps he or she will change the contours of the policy. Then he or she will realize where would there be a problem in implementing it. You can have a vision, But if you have a policy, then policy needs to be implemented, and you have to look at the implementation dimensions of that policy. Now, I'll give you one example. I can go on and on in this, but since I'm discussing national education policy, I'll just give you one point. Now, one of the 7 dimensions that I had mentioned was financial viability. हमारी तरफ यूपी में कहते हैं जेब में नहीं पत्ता चल दिए कलकत्ता. You know, unless you have the money to back it, what is the big deal in announcing big things? You know, it has stopped now, but till about 5 years ago, every railway minister used to announce a number of railway lines, knowing fully well they would not be implemented. Now look at the national education policy. Some of the finest provisions that you can think of are there in the policy, but what about implementing them? You know, the policy says that 6% of the GDP should be allocated to education. Now, this is nothing new. In fact, if you read Dr. Kothari Commission's report, there also he had recommended 6% of GDP. As the Education Secretary, I know for sure that the highest ever has been 3.1% of the GDP. And the tragedy, look at that. 2020, the policy gets announced. When the budget gets announced in 2020 for 21-22, the allocation for education comes down in nominal terms from the previous year. Comes down, forget 6%. It is less than last year. Now, there are circumstances in which it happened, but fact of the matter is, if Dr. Kasturi Rangan and the policy makers had kept that in mind, and if I were in their place, I would have said, if the allocation is 3%, these should be the priority items, rest can be taken up. That's what the department is doing now, because the money is scarce. So then you cut your cloth according to the size of the cloth. You can't announce it. And you know, everyone discusses it. So, whereas in the context of national education policy, it was politically acceptable. It was also socially desirable, certainly technologically feasible, but I doubt about its financial viability. Because without that money, what does that document mean? In fact, when I now interact with some of the officers of the department, they're tearing their hair out. They've been asked to do something for which there's no financial backing. Right now, the situation is the state governments are finding it difficult to fund the salaries of their teachers. What are we talking about? So there's no harm in having a vision. But there's a difference between a vision and a policy. Vision you can have that this is what we will try and aspire. That is aspirational. But I think policy, to my mind, has to be more concrete in terms of its implementation. So that is as far as policy is concerned. Let me also I can talk about other policies also, but I would rather spend time discussing with you. Let me touch upon a scheme, which is also a part of a policy. How does a scheme get formulated? And since Madam Vijay Lakshmi has read my book, I will pick up from there. You know, the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister, announced from the ramparts of Red Fort that there would be a health insurance policy for the poorest of the poor in the country. Now, announcement was made even before any groundwork had been done. That's how the government functions. More often than not, someone wakes up with a very nice dream and goes on, announces it, and then you are there to put your square peg in the round hole, try and somehow work out a policy. So that government was very fond of setting up a group of ministers. So this group of ministers was set up. I was at that point in time in the Ministry of Labor, where I soon discovered that not much happened in the ministry, and that could be true of many other ministries. And the rationale that I thought of at that point in time was that since each one of us was in labor, by definition, we couldn't deliver, because if we delivered, we'll be out of labor. And hence, we were perpetually in pain doing nothing. In fact, in labor ministry, the joke was that we used to have these tripartite discussions with the labor unions and the owners and ourselves for days on end. And in the month of May, it used to become so hot in Delhi that 25 of us used to go for 25 days to Geneva to find the solution to the labor problems of this country. And we never found them, because if you found them next year, you won't go to Geneva. Of course, I put a stop to that nonsense. And many civil servants would be cursing me for that, because I thought we were doing nothing there for 25 days and coming back. Of course, Geneva is a beautiful place to visit there. But then the monotony of beauty is such that after 1 or 2 visits, you start getting bored. So I was the one who initiated that. And I'm told that visit has been curtailed from 25 to a few days, 3-4 days. So coming back to the topic that I was mentioning, that in this was announced, and a committee was constituted under the chairmanship of Mr. Chidambaram. And in the first meeting, my minister was supposed to go. He couldn't go, secretary couldn't go. So as Director General Labor Welfare, I went to that meeting. I had not much to do, but I thought I would be just present there. Mr. Chidambaram, who was chairing the meeting, turned towards the health secretary and asked him to formulate a scheme, health insurance scheme, now that it was announced. He somehow wriggled out of it. He said, sir, we are doing NRHM and we won't be able to do it. Then he turned towards his right, towards Secretary Banking and Insurance, who later on became CAG of India, and made life difficult for the government. The government came down, but at that point in time, Secretary Banking and Insurance, he turned towards him and asked him to prepare a scheme because it was a health insurance scheme. He said, sir, we are already doing a universal health insurance scheme and that's going nowhere. I mean, world over, there was a problem with the health insurance scheme. But in government, what happens is, I want to tell you this, that they will try and catch hold of somebody, probably the weakest chap sitting in the room, to ask him to do things which otherwise are not doable. So suddenly someone whispered something in the ears of the minister, and I heard my name being announced. Use Anil Swarup. I stood up with folded hands. He said, you will do health insurance. Sir, I am already in labor, already in pain. Why do you want to add this? So he took, he understood my joke, but he shouted and he said, what do you mean? Prime Minister has announced the scheme, you will do it. Then I asked him, sir, what has Labour Ministry to do with health insurance? He says, it is meant for workers, and hence you have to do it. So I said, sir, by that definition, all the schemes of the government should come to me. So of course, in government, they don't listen to you. They take a decision. I was told. I came out of the room like a zombie. I didn't know what had hit me. This is how schemes get formulated in the government, I'm telling you. But what I did was, I constituted a small group, got experts from World Bank, UNO, all those people came, and we formulated a scheme that came to be recognized world over as one of the finest schemes of the world. But God was kind to me. I had a fantastic team. I got the support from almost everyone and got this scheme going. Why am I telling you this? It's unfortunately, most of the schemes and policies are formulated in the manner that I told you. It's very unfortunate. Sometimes they work. More often than not, they don't work. And this is the reason. Because while formulating the policies, there is a huge disconnect between what we think in Delhi, and we unfortunately think that all wisdom resides here rather than what happens in the field. In fact, when I became Education Secretary, I discovered this. Before Education Secretary, I was Coal Secretary, Government of India. And even then, I didn't know much about the coal sector. So when I got posted as Coal Secretary, I rang up a friend of mine and asked him, "Yaar, ye coal sector kaisa hai?" He instead of answering my question, asked me a question. He said, "Gangs of Wasseypur dekhi hai kya?" So that answered my question. But again, I had a fantastic team, and on account of that team, we managed to sort out all the coal problem. Again, on account of paucity of time, I can't go into the details of it. But when the court problem was sorted out, I used to go to the PMO requesting them to wind up the ministry, because the government was saying more governance, less government. So I thought, might as well wind up this ministry, it's not needed. When I went there for the second or third time, I remember they got fed up of my visits. And at that point in time, they were looking for the most uneducated, illiterate civil servant to be made Education Secretary, Government of India. And they found that in Mr. Anil Swarup. So I was posted as School Education Secretary with no experience whatsoever. And at that point in time, this education policy was being formulated. So, this word went around that there is an ignorant, illiterate man as Education Secretary. But people in India and across the world are very kind. They come and give you advice. We call them Rai Sahabs in UP. They wouldn't have done anything in their lifetime, but they're very good at giving advice, especially those that come across the Atlantic. They live in the cool climes, and sometimes they travel to India to give you advice, and sometimes they come here for a year or two. Then they find the terrain very, very hot. They go back to the US and then continue to pontificate from there. We have a lot of Rai Sahabs coming. So such Rai Sahabs used to come. One such Rai Sahab came and advised me, "Sir, why don't you visit England, Finland, Holland, Scotland, New Zealand?" Before he could complete the list of lands, I asked him, "Have you visited motherland?" He didn't initially catch my praise, but then understood it. That is the problem with the policy formulation in India. I think a lot of it happens in the Western world, and in many of whom have not traveled to the ground side. So I decided to travel throughout the country. I visited 24 states in the first 3 months of my existence as Education Secretary. And the first 2 districts that I visited were Bastar and Sukma. I had a lot of traveling from Pune to Goa, dropping down on the way, looking at the school, traveling from Srinagar to Leh, not taking the national highway, going deep inside mountains to understand the ground reality. Now, my dear friends, if you want to be a part of a policy formulation initiative, then apart from your communication skills, analytical capabilities, research capabilities, you must be in touch with the ground reality. That is an a priori requirement. If you are not in touch with the ground reality, I think you will come up with a brilliant paper like the National Education Policy is. And I guaranteed the day policy came that it will be very, very difficult to implement this policy. You will come up with most brilliant of papers. In fact, my take with McKinsey, my take with the World Bank used to be, have you ever evaluated what happened to those brilliant reports that you produce here? Not many do that. And I'm not against economists and theorists, but what I say is, if you are not in touch with the ground reality, then becoming an accomplished performer will be very, very difficult, because the man on the ground does not want the, I mean, you can have your great documents, but he couldn't care less. He is more bothered about how it rolls out on the ground, what happens on the ground. And this brings me to this subject that you have for me. What is your role in this? And I'm going to disappoint you here, because I'm not going to talk to you about what you can do to the policy. I'm going to talk to you about what you can do to yourself. Now, it's very easy to tell somebody else what he needs to do. But today I'm going to tell you what we can do to ourselves. To me, that's most important. To me, everybody seems to be bothered about what needs to be done to the nation, to the society. And I tell every young man, become selfish. Now, it's wrong of me to say that, but that's what I say. Why selfish? I start by understanding what the Mahatma said. And you know, one book that influenced my life, there are many books. I'm a very avid reader. I read a lot, but some books really influenced me. And the biggest influence was on me was my experiments with truth. Because the essence of that book is, be the change you wish to see in the world. Now, unless I change myself, what am I talking about? We can have a great academic discussion on what the world should do, what the country should do, what the society should do. No. खुद ही को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे बता तेरी रजा क्या है. These are the concluding lines of my book, Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant. People ask me, and I'll bring that to you finally. Why did I write the second book when I had already written a book on civil servant? I wrote it, and that some of you may relate to it. I wrote it because I used to visit the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy very regularly to interact with officers of various seniority. When youngsters like you join the civil service, there's a lot of enthusiasm. They want to do things. But as they go up the ladder, that enthusiasm wanes, they become cynical. And I try to understand why. Most of the officers become cynical because they start blaming the circumstances, the surroundings, the politician for their inability to do things. You know, they suffer from this. Umr bhar yahi bhool karta raha ghalib, dhool chehre pe thi, aina malta raha. You know, the problem is that we keep looking outside for my own problems. We look at the society, we look at the country, we look at somebody else. My suggestion to you all youngsters is, you can't do a nut to others. You can't do anything to others. Even as IS officers, we thought we'll do this, we'll do. No. Whatever you can do is to do it to yourself. Khudi ko kar buland. Hum apni khudi ko buland. Now the next question is, hum apni khudi ko buland kaise kare? Because that's the logical step. And when I talk to you about your contribution to policy, or for that matter, anything in the society, unless you have your feet firmly on the ground, unless you are tall enough to be recognized and seen, how do you think you're going to contribute? You want to contribute without knowing yourself well. You want to contribute without becoming yourself what you can. I don't think you should even think in terms of contributing. You should only think in terms of contributing to your own growth. And I can guarantee that if you evolve as an enlightened citizen, you would have contributed to the society, to the policy and the country. Then you don't have to go to somebody to ask him to contribute. They will come to you to ask you to contribute. That's what you got to do. Now, how do you go about it? Just 2 suggestions before I conclude, because then we'll have an interactive session. Suggestion number 1, and you can take it or leave it. Suggestion number 1 is that we spend so much time brooding over the past that we don't have time for the present. And I've asked this question of many people, can you change your past? I don't think anyone can, except a few historians pushed by some politicians, can change the past a bit, but most of us cannot change the past, can we? So why waste time on it? The only value that the past has for us is some learnings of that past. If I've committed some mistake, let me not brood over it, but try and understand it. Now, you know, the second which emerges out of it is, Don't worry about committing mistakes. Everyone does that. Don't worry about failures. Everyone in this life has failed. Since I'm suggesting this, I switched over from inter science, class 12 science, to arts. And my articulation was very poor. I couldn't speak a sentence, write a sentence in English or Hindi. So I went through a drill to improve my communication skills. I wanted to become a debater, and I distinctly remember in one of the debating competitions, I forgot what I had to say, and I had to go out. There was another instance narrated in my book that I had gone to IIT Kanpur as a debater from my university. And I, at that point in time, thought that I was a singer. Many of us think that we are singers. I thought I was fairly an accomplished singer. So I participated in the music competition also. And sure enough, IIT Kanpur, I shouldn't be calling it a crowd, but students can be really troublesome. So when I started singing, I picked up the wrong note. Sure enough, within 15 seconds, I was booed out of that auditorium. I was booed out. I was shattered, absolutely. It was one of my seniors who came and told me, yaar, wo to ho gaya, kab tak us pe chipke rahoge? Your forte is tomorrow, you're debating. If you keep getting stuck in the past failures, you will never be able to move forward. A lesson which I still remember. Next day, there was this debating competition. When I went over to speak, the moment my name was announced, everyone started shouting, Gayak aa gaya, because they remembered the mess up that I had created the previous day. But by which time I had overcome my failure, I went there and spoke, won the first prize, and never looked back thereafter. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, all of us commit mistakes, all of us have got failures. Now you want to suggest and become a part of policy formulation, but you have not got over your own mistakes and failures. How would you suggest? So khud hi ko aapko buland karna hai. And finally, I mean, I can go on and on in this subject. And finally, I think let us stop spending time over issues over which we have no control. Look at the amount of time that we waste over issues. I distinctly remember when I had got into the service and I had got married, I used to get very agitated with traffic jams. Some of us are still are. My wife was traveling with me, and one day I was tearing my hair out and she asked me, "Tum inka kuch kar sakte ho?" So I told her, "Main kya kar sakta hu inka?" Then she said, "Jab inka kuch kar nahi sakte ho, to apna khoon kyun jala rahe ho?" That I still remember, that why fret over issues over which you control. I'll conclude with a personal example in this. I was, before I joined the IS, I was in the police service. I was undergoing training there. So one of these officers, my colleague officers, walked up to me. I'm talking 1980. He walked up to me, he said, "Boss, raat ko neend nahi aa rahi." हमने क्या हो गया? बोले, "Boss, पेट्रोलियम के दाम बहुत बढ़ रहे हैं." So I said, "हाँ, बढ़ तो रहे हैं, but तुम्हारी रात को ना सोने से क्या ठीक हो जाएगा ये?" बोले, "नहीं बॉस, देश की आर्थिक स्थिति पर कुप्रभाव पड़ रहा है." There were always these economists or so-called economists very worried, doing nothing about it, but worried. I used to call them Mr. Parishan. तो मैंने कहा, यार ठीक है, तुम्हारे चर्चा के लिए ठीक है, हम लोग प्रयास करते हैं, रात की नींद क्यों हराम कर रहे हो? रात की नींद तो उस चीज के लिए हराम करो जिसके लिए कुछ कर सकते हो। बोला, हाँ यार सही कह रहे हो। चला गया। 3 महीने बाद फिर आया, कहता, बॉस रात को नींद दिया। अब क्या हो गया? पेट्रोल के दाम तो अपने आप ठीक हो गए बिना तुम्हारे इंटरवेंशन के। नहीं बॉस, देश की पॉपुलेशन बहुत बढ़ रही है। मैंने कहा, यार रात को सो जाओ, अपने आप ठीक हो जाएगी। The point that I was trying to drive home, and I continue to drive home to youngsters like you, is there's so much to be done, but until you're focused on what you can, you will never be able to accomplish. And as you do that, and I tell that to fellow colleague officers, remember these seminal words by Reinhold Niebuhr: "Lord, grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change, courage to change things I can, and wisdom to understand the difference between the two." Thank you very much. I would have gone on and on. This is a very interesting subject, but I'll stop here. Maybe while answering your questions, I'll touch upon some of the issues that have been left out. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I always love to come and interact with you all. A few years ago, it was physically, now it's virtually. I remember my first ever visit to Miranda House as a strapping student in a debating competition long, long ago. This was 1978, if I remember, or 77, I remember. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Open to you. You can shoot any question under the sun. The advantage that I have is I don't have to appear in any exam now. So I can say, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your insightful remarks on this topic on how can we as youth contribute to the public policy process. It was extremely great. We are extremely grateful to you so that we have been able to listen to you live here. All of us have watched a lot of YouTube talks, And trust me, it's an immense pleasure to listen to you, your enthusiasm and energetic talk live. Without any further ado, I would like to open the floor for questions. Anybody who wants to raise any questions, to please use the raise hand option that you will see on your screen. Once you raise your hand, we will unmute you and you can ask your question to sir directly. Okay, I can already see 2 participants who've raised their hands. Can I please ask Nidhi to unmute them?
Bharti, I've sent you a request.
Bharti, you're unmuted. Yeah.
Again and again, it's popping on my screen. Am I audible now?
Yes, Bharti,
Yes.
you're audible now.
Good morning, sir. So my question is, can you please throw some light on the challenges faced by the civil servants in fulfillment of their responsibilities in the present times?
Oh my God, you will have to read my book. It will require much longer, but I'll just try and briefly tell you. You know, all times have their challenges. It's not merely the current times. Everyone talks about it's very difficult. You know, it's not that. I have often said that you can't do anything to the circumstances that you have, can you? Circumstances are what they are, but you can do a lot. You know, the inspiration for me to do what I'm doing comes from such officers who are able to perform and do well in these set of circumstances. Now, I can tell you names, you may not be able to relate to them. The circumstances for them were also very difficult. So when TN Session reformed the Election Commission, do you think everything was fine? And if everything was fine, why didn't his predecessors reform it? Secondly, when Julius Ribeiro handled the terrorist problem in Punjab, do you think circumstances were fine? But in the same set of circumstances, Mr. Ribeiro did what he did. I can go on and on. If you read my book, I've quoted 50 odd officers who performed well. Now the question is, where am I looking? Am I looking at non-performers and corrupt officers, or am I looking at those officers who managed to perform given the set of circumstances? So there is no point in discussing circumstances because that will be more of an academic exercise. But as a performer, I believe that I would try and carve out my role in the given set of circumstances and try and do my best. Results are not in my hand. I remember when I was a youngster, I never won a cup or a trophy or a certificate till class 7, and I used to feel very frustrated. My mother used to tell me, which I didn't understand at that point in time, I discovered it much later. She used to say, Karmanyavadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. I didn't understand it then. She tried to explain, still I didn't understand. I used to be, but later on in my life, I discovered how important it is. So the moment you are focused on what you are doing, on your karma, I think you would have done your job. But if you're bothered about the implications, the results, then there could be trouble. If you get a positive result, it's an icing on the case. If you don't get it, it's beyond you. I mean, I could have narrated a few instances, but I would refrain from them. I would suggest that if you do find time, read the book. You will find a number of incidents in that book which will actually explain what you're trying to understand here.
Thank you so much, Bharti, for your question. Thank you so much, sir, for answering it. May I now request Nidhi to please unmute Kanak?
Yes.
I'm here. Good morning, sir. Thank you for those words. My question to you is that given that IAS officers are given the opportunity to serve in various capacities across the administrative spectrum, does it become tedious at times to handle diametrically opposite fields, one after the other, due to lack of past experience or frequent shifting of departments?
You know, a lot depends on the officer himself. It's not tedious at all, actually. It's you enjoy these changes. I enjoyed them, each one of them. It all depends on you, whether you treat it as a tedium or whether you enjoy the changes, you enjoy the challenges. I enjoyed every challenge, and that's the reason, and I wish that if I were to be born again, I'd like to be an IAS officer. If it were a tedium, I wouldn't have ever wished that. So it's that way. It is not very difficult, you know. You have to indulge in understanding each department. It does take more than 1 or 2 months for you to understand it. I can say that with my personal experience, because ultimately, as you go up the ladder, it is not the expertise that is required. It is the attitude that is required. It is your approach to managing men and women. I've often said that the strength of the IAS is not its expertise in general, but its understanding of human beings, its capability of making the best out of the staff or the people or the team that you have. That's what your strength is. And people who try to become experts, you can never ever become as expert as an expert who spent his lifetime in a particular subject. Never tried it. To give you an example, I think as a civil servant, I must have been use technology to the hilt. In fact, in the last 3 assignments, I dispensed with papers, files. We didn't have paper file. I did everything on my laptop, but I can barely operate my laptop. So you don't have to know technology to use it. You don't have to know C++ to use technology. You must know how to make use of that technology rather than how to use the technology. So that's very important if you have that attitude. I have been writing very often these days that it is not expertise, but the attitude that matters. Even if you have best of technology, if you don't have the attitude to do it, and attitude you can cultivate over a period of time. It doesn't happen overnight, but you cultivate over a period.
Thank you, sir. Dia, I'm unmuting you next.
Good morning, sir. That was indeed an insightful talk, and I got to learn a lot. However, I have a question related to policies. So, sir, if a policy, if it fails or if not implemented, if you mentioned that it generates economy and employment in the society. So, how does it affect the society and the people the people and the citizens, if it is not implemented or if it fails eventually? So, I would really like to know a little.
First, let us understand the prime objective of policy. Objective is articulation in a very structured manner of ideas of the government. That's very important, because otherwise it's nebulous, vague. You don't know. It gives you a direction. So policy has a role to play. But each policy has to be followed by an action plan. That's where the problem comes. When you work out a detailed action plan, which I mentioned, what to do, how to do, who would do it, by when it will be done, that's where you start going into the nitty-gritty of its actual implementation. That's where the problems arise, because then you realize what are the limitations to implementation of those policies. Now, having just a policy is meaningless, actually, to me. But policy is essential, not a necessary. It's not a sufficient condition. It's a necessary condition, because direction is certainly very important for any government or a nation or a society. Direction is like a rudder. But the speed does not come from that. Speed comes from the engine who has to make things happen. And if it doesn't happen, then the policy becomes, you just keep standing at a place with a rudder in a particular direction. It doesn't work. But if you just have speed without direction, then also there is a problem. So both are required. So in India, I don't see dearth of policies in the country. I mean, that's my personal experience. But implementation is really an issue. And if that doesn't happen, people won't be impacted, as we see in a number of policies.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dia. Neha, I'm unmuting you next.
Good morning, sir. Sir, my question is, what was your motivation behind starting the Nexus of Good initiative?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question. I should have spoken about it. When I was getting close to my retirement, I was getting upset at the negativity around me. Nation wants to know only negative things. The world has either collapsed or would collapse. You open a TV channel, news channel, all negative. And during my visits to various states, I found some outstanding work being done. I mean, amazing work. I can narrate some of them, but again, paucity of time, I'm not doing that. Some of them are given in my book. Now, my idea was that if good things are happening, why aren't they getting noticed? And I try to understand that for the simple reason that we are very fond of masala. And if you have negative news, we like to read it. The positive news, we don't like it. So I wanted to create a parallel narrative of Nexus of Good. Now, what is this? Basically, identify good work that is happening around you. Then try and understand that good work, how it is happening. And if you're convinced, appreciate that good work. In my part of the world, in UP, they say, "Hum mukt kand se burai to karte hain, mukt kand se tareef kyun nahi karte?" Why are we somehow fight shy of it? So I wanted to create a narrative of appreciation. So if you understand the good work, aap uski mukt kand se tareef kijiye. So I wanted to create a platform where this appreciation would come, so that we are able to demonstrate to the doubters that good can be done because it is being done. Normally we say good should be done without demonstrating that it is being done. Only thing is that good that is being done is neither being noticed, and since it is not being noticed, it is not being appreciated. So if I provide a platform, we've got these platforms of Twitter handle, which is @Nexus of Good. We now have a portal, www.nexusofgood.org.in, where almost every day a positive story is staged. Then we have these fortnightly, monthly webinars where we provide that platform of those that are going to doing good work to roadshow the good work they're doing, thereby convincing the doubters that good can be done because it is being done. Now, if that happens, then the next step that we do is to scale it, because good itself is not sufficient. It needs to be scaled. And this scaling can come through public-private partnership. I was also upset at this, sparring between public and private, which is going on even now. We forget that there are outstanding people in the public as well as private. In the public domain, in government sector, everyone feels that the private sector is making money only. That's the only business. In the private sector, everyone thinks that everyone in the government is corrupt. Both are equally wrong. There are good people on either side of the fence. If all the rascals and ruffians of the world can come together and make life difficult for us, how about good people coming together and making life easy for everyone? That's the essence of Nexus of Good.
Thank you so much, sir. I would now be unmuting Abhishank sir next.
Thank you for that, Bhumika. Thank you, Swaroop sir, for such an excellent exposition on, how you've lived your life as a civil servant, as well as giving a beginner's guide to students as to how you should approach, say, policy issues. I had a couple of, questions related to what you said. You also very well, I think, pointed out how there's a gap between practitioners and academicians and how that needs to be bridged in some way. I think one thing that I wanted to point out was that, is it important for the subjects of policy, the people who are going to take on the policy, whose lives are going to be affected by the policy, should they not be taken into confidence while making policy? First is that. The second question is whether better social audits should be done to audit how the community feels about it. Another important, I think, element that while you were speaking, I think it just struck me that you talked about how improvisation is important, right? In policy, it's not about the rigidity of the policy itself, but how you can improvise to make that policy work. And with that lies the question of contingency, because you talked about how, say, you projected a 6%, percent of the GDP going to the education sector, but you've not taken into contingencies such as, say, a pandemic or other things, right? So what is the role, do you think, of improvisation and taking into account contingencies along with social audits in policy making itself? Thank you.
Abhishank, I agree with all three of you, and I'll tell you how it is operating and how it could be improved upon. First of all, I'm a great believer that unless you have all stakeholders into confidence, no policy or anything will work. And I've had personal experience of that. If you read my book, the Coal Story is all about taking stakeholders into confidence. We managed to overcome one of the severest crises in the country by producing coal to an extent that we were thinking in terms of exporting coal to Bangladesh. And this could happen only because I could take each stakeholder into intensive confidence for formulating a policy and an action plan. So I totally agree with you, because the stakeholders know what is their problem. I can't visualize, I can visualize some of it, not all of it. I have always believed that even with your adversary, you must have a communication. You must talk to them, because you are the ultimate decision maker. By depriving of yourself of some of the wisdom that might exist even with your adversary, it's your loss, not his loss. So it's always better to interact with the stakeholders, including those that may be your adversaries. So I totally agree with you. Second, also I agree with you, because social audit is the best way of auditing, actually. I have always believed in transparency. One of the reasons why I focused on technology was that once you become totally transparent and the public can see what you're doing, malafidis will never be attributed to you. And it is in your own interest. And there's a full chapter in my book where I advocate total transparency of your activity so that there can be a social audit. People asked me, I was heading a group called Project Monitoring Group. at the time when all scams were breaking out. In fact, I was posted there to fast track projects above 1,000 crores each. And we managed to facilitate clearance of 5 lakh crores worth of project during those scam times with not a single finger being pointed towards me. It is still being quoted as one of the best experiments to fast track projects. Now, why did I come out unscathed in that as well as in code? Simple. Keep social audit open. Let anybody, everybody have access to that information. That's the first step towards social audit. The moment we start hiding information, we will be in trouble, scheme will be in trouble. My simple philosophy is, if I have nothing to hide, why should I hide? So I totally agree with you that there has to be social audit. There could be frivolous complaints, but over a period of time, you would have established your credentials. And I benefited enormously out of it because of the credibility that you generate through being transparent, because I demonstrated to everyone that I have absolutely nothing to hide. And this can happen only if you not only consult with your stakeholders, but also keep everything transparent to be audited socially. You know, these professional auditors, they have the job, they will do the job, but nothing like social audit. So I agree both of your suggestions. Some of us are not inclined towards that, but I have a different view on that.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering that. I would now be unmuting Akriti Jha next.
Thank you for such an enthralling talk, sir. Sir, so my question to you is, do you believe that India's public policy landscape requires an overhaul in terms of its capacity to bring about substantial transformation in a short span of time? And for this, do you think that the youth should be given the lead to form the policies or give the ideas which are better suited and more innovative, while the more experienced personnel works in the background?
You know, ideally speaking, I would want you to contribute, not formulate. You know, for formulation, the attributes required are totally different. I'm not very sure whether the youth will be in a position to formulate that policy. You've had to add some other experience also, but certainly contribute to the formulation of the policy through their ideas. Because without those inputs, because those fresh ideas, you know, unencumbered ideas, I don't think policies will have a fresh direction. That is certainly required. But as far as formulation is concerned, I have my reservations whether the youth is ready, because the attributes, as I said, required for formulating a policy are very different.
Thank you, sir, for answering that question. Next, I would be unmuting Akula Pari Siri. You may please go ahead with your question.
Since he's raised his hand, he's unable to unmute himself.
Yeah.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, you are audible. You are audible.
Good morning, sir. It was an honor attending this meeting today. Sir, my question is, like you rightly pointed out, that we won't be able to bring the type of change that we want to see in the society, like not always. Or isn't it disappointing that we are not able to see the change or bring in the change that we want to see in the world? Like being students or being civil aspirants, we want to change a lot of things. Like some of the things we are not satisfied in the current society. But it is very disappointing that when we realize that we won't be able to bring the real change in the world, that of course we are motivated to bring in change within us, but I'm just scared that it would end up within me. So how do we spread it in the world, or how do we try changing the society or something like that?
My dear friend, it's easy to wish to change the society. And don't be disappointed if you're unable to change the society. Be disappointed if you're unable to change yourself. So focus totally on yourself. I see a lot of obsession amongst youngsters to change the world without even looking inwards as to where do they stand. Okay. Take, for example, you were absolutely behind the curtain till you came to ask me this question. And we were discussing transparency just before that. Is it fine with you? How can you expect others to be transparent when you are not transparent? And then you get very agitated that I am unable to change the society. Don't waste your time in changing the society. change yourself. And let me tell you, with my personal experience of 38 years in the government and even thereafter, I'm convinced that if I change myself, I'll be able to change a bit of my surrounding as well. I'm not changing the society again. If you have a halo of a God, then you will change the world like Jesus Christ. Maybe even he didn't start to change the world straight away. I mean, look at the sacrifices that he did. Look at any great man that you look, he started with himself. He may not say so. No, you don't even want to start with yourself and you feeling irritated at not being able to change the society. I'm sorry to say that you'll continue to be irritated in your life. So stop. I'm sorry for using this word. Stop thinking about others. Become selfish. Focus on yourself. I can tell you that you change yourself, you will see the change around you. But without changing yourself, you can become frustrated. The world is not changing. World is not you because you can't change. Let's admit that as a fact. Why are we trying to change others and the world without changing myself? I'll tell you simple. When I was evolving as an individual, as a youngster, and when I couldn't speak fluently, I used to derive enormous amount of satisfaction when that fluency started coming in me. Now, without being a fluent speaker, without being a good communicator, do you think you can change others? Or you will only think that somehow the world has to change. Hamari maange puri ho chahe jo majburi ho. It doesn't work that way. It has to start with you. And having experienced it myself and helped a few people to experience it, once you experience it, you try and discover the power that lies in you before trying to destroy or disturb or change somebody else. Improve yourself as an individual first. Otherwise, who's going to reckon with you? आप अपनी खुद ही बुलंद नहीं करेंगे तो कौन आपसे आएगा पूछने के लिए पॉलिसी बताइए हमें. Amongst your friends, let me give you an example. Amongst your friends, you will find one or two girls as such who everyone wants to talk to. Why is it that? Why is it that? They don't want. You want to talk to him. Why? Because उन्होंने अपनी खुदी को थोड़ा बुलंद कर लिया है. They have evolved as individuals to be reckoned with. So my friend, try and evolve as an individual to be reckoned with. And you can do that actually. You can sit with your friends, you can sit with some guide and identify what should you do to yourself. Don't identify कि देश के लिए क्या करें. और चलो मोर्चा निकालते हैं. अरे भाई क्या बहुत लोग हैं मोर्चा निकालने के लिए. आप अपना मोर्चा निकालिए ना. So focus totally on yourself. I'm sorry for giving you a different lesson altogether because everyone is charged to देश का कुछ करेंगे. कर लिए देश का भी करिए, इसका कोई नहीं. तो पहले अपना तो कीजिए भाई.
Thank you so much, sir, for that very important lesson. I think I totally agree with you here because it also reminds me of this teaching that one cannot serve from an empty cup. So one has to improve on one's own weaknesses and identify one's own strengths and then contribute in the areas which will be the most impactful for one. Yes, sir.
Bhumika, I'm glad you're saying. See, another point that I'd like to add is,
yes,
all of us have shortcomings. I have shortcomings even now.
Yes.
There is no harm in accepting those shortcomings. It's human to have shortcomings. So instead of looking at shortcomings in others, you look at your own shortcomings and see how can you overcome. Now, how do you overcome them? Some of them I told you earlier, but you can look at those that do not have those shortcomings. Now, the tragedy of our education system is that we are taught to compete. Unfortunately, every individual is very unique in her nature. You can't compete with and you shouldn't be competing. Anyone to compete is with yourself. You have to compete with yourself. The moment you start competing with others, you can learn from others. If you compete with others, वो तो अपनी कॉपी छुपा लेगा, आपको क्यों दिखाएगा भाई? वो भी आपसे compete कर रहा है. So the best is, I'm telling you, I pick it up. If you read my book, I picked it up with my colleagues. One of my class fellows had a phenomenal handwriting. Very good. I could barely scribble. So I was young. I changed my handwriting. I tried to improve upon my handwriting. I admitted the fact that my writing is bad. What is the harm in admitting it? हम क्या करते हैं, कोई तिनका लगे उस पे powder लगा लिया. Instead of doing that, if I cure it, because once you reveal a wound, the chances of it getting cured are more. And this confidence can come in you by believing that almost everyone on this earth has some shortcomings. I've yet to come across a perfect person. So what's the big deal if I have some? Once you have that, you'll start. See, all my communication to you is yourself and myself, not others at all.
Definitely, sir. I think all of us throughout our lives remain learners. So we should always focus on learning at every step in our lives. Definitely.
You know, I admire the humility of your principal. You know, I'm really humbled by what she said. I mean, I was aghast, pleasantly aghast to see what she said, and says so much to learn from her. You know, despite being where she is, what is the message she's conveying to all of us? I wish there were many, many more teachers like her. See, the humility helps. There's no harm in being humble. There's no harm in accepting things. There's no harm in praising others. In fact, if once you start enjoying praising others, you've arrived.
Yes, sir. Definitely, sir.
For those
Continuing with,
thank you, sir.
continuing with the question answer session, I would now be unmuting Ravveer Kaur next.
Good morning, sir. Thank you so much for such an insightful session. So my question, it pertains to convergence between policymakers and laymen. Because I believe that even policymakers have their limits in understanding certain nuances. So when a policy is prepared targeting resources or practices or certain aspects of a particular region or a community, what do you think is the extent to which we need to involve the targeted in the discussion, and what are the limits to that involvement?
Let me start with an example to illustrate how correct you are. It will be difficult for me to give you a measure that this should be the extent of engagement. It will depend on policy to policy. When I was asked to do that health insurance scheme, which came to be recognized world over, to begin with, I tried to understand my target group. In the private sector, they understand the consumer, and then they will decide whether Aishwarya Rai should advertise or Amitabh Bachchan should advertise. In government, we don't do that. We hardly look at the target group, and hence we come up with this policy. In this particular scheme of RSBY, we looked at our target group, which was the poorest of the poor. And hence we ended up designing a policy taking care of the attributes of this poor man. What were the three major attributes? Number one, most of them are illiterate. So we had to have a paperless health insurance scheme. There was not a paperless health insurance scheme in the world. Secondly, not only was he illiterate, he didn't have money, because some insurance policy you have to pay in advance to the hospital and then you get the reimbursement. So we had to have a cashless scheme. Third, this poor man traveled from one district to the other in search of employment, and there was not a single policy of the government which was portable. So public distribution system, you could have it in the district, MNRIG in the district. You couldn't get this facility elsewhere. So we had to come up with a portable policy. So we understood this chap and then used technology through a smart card and made this policy paperless, cashless, and portable. First ever scheme in the world. And hence it succeeded. It succeeded to an extent that when the new government came, it thought that the policy belonged to the previous government, it dumped it. After 3 years, and let me narrate this incident to you, before my retirement, just before my retirement, I was called by the PM to explain health insurance scheme, because many people couldn't explain to him and he didn't know what to do. So I, as education secretary, went and explained the scheme to him. And sure enough, you have Ayushman Bharat today as a health insurance scheme, which rides on RSBY. So the point that I'm trying to make here is just to reinforce what you've said. We have to account for the target group for whom the scheme is made. Unfortunately, in most of the government schemes, we don't do that.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering that question. Next, I would be unmuting Harshpreet Kaur.
Good morning, sir. So my question is to you that as we are shown in the movies like Jai Ganga Jal, in that it is shown that the IPS officer who was working very honestly, he was transferred actually by the Vidhayak. So, sir, is it a very big weapon of the government that they can transfer the officers if they are working very honestly? What is the ground reality? Like, people tell us it is a very big weapon which is used. And how can we tackle with this problem? Actually, that when you are working honestly and you are transferred. Thank you, sir.
First of all, why is transfer a punishment? Let me give you an example. Of course, there are 2-3 incidents in my book on transfer, because this is a very sensitive issue with many people. You know, I remember I was posted as Secretary of Horticulture, and there was this corrupt minister who wanted me to suspend an officer. He was legally authorized to suspend him. This is an incident mentioned in my book. I found out about that officer. He was honest and efficient. It's not merely transfer. He wanted him to be suspended because this officer was not paying up the minister. So what I did was I found a provision wherein it was indicated that if I disagreed with the minister, I could route the file through the minister, through the chief secretary, who's my boss. So I spoke to the chief secretary, very fine officer. He said, file mujhe bhej do. I thought, let me buy some time. So I sent the file to him with my note. Now this minister did not speak to the chief secretary. He went and spoke to the chief minister. Consequent to which, I don't know what transpired between them, but I was transferred out. Now the chief secretary was very upset. He called me. He said, yaar, tum usko bachane ke chakkar mein tumhara transfer ho gaya. Like you are upset. Where are you? I can't see you now. The person who asked me question. Okay. Anyway, so he called me. I said, sir, kyun pareshan hote hain? For a civil servant, transfer is like death. It is inevitable. Jo hona hai uske liye kyun pareshan hona? And then in any case, I believe in Hindu philosophy. I'll be reborn, no? You're not throwing me out of the service. You'll post me somewhere else. I'll do my job there. Now, this is another instance where you don't have any control over what your transfer. Why bother about it? You know, it's not that I was not transferred. Gradually, the Neta came to understand that I don't feel harassed by being transferred. So, uska to maza khatam hi ho gaya yaar. जब उसका मजा खत्म हो गया, उसने मुझे ट्रांसफर करना बंद कर दिया. आप परेशान होंगे तो he will feel that he can harass you by transferring when I am not getting harassed. You know, my friend, listen to this carefully. No one can harass you until you feel harassed. No one can embarrass you until you feel embarrassed. No one can humiliate you until you feel humiliated. You are the center of universe. Think over it. You know, I stopped bothering about transfers. You know, it was inconvenient, but to call it a penalty, you know, I see some of my colleague officers wearing it on their sleeve as a medal of honor that I've been transferred so many times. You know, I can go on this aspect of transfer quite a lot because we assume that what we are saying is right and politician is always wrong, which is totally incorrect. I also had that assumption when I joined the service. Later on, I discovered politicians also work in a particular context. We can't say everything that they do is wrong. They are as good, as bad as we are. They don't come from Timbuktu. They are from this society. Once you understand that, you start accommodating. There's a difference between accommodation and compromise. Civil servants who confuse between accommodation and compromise land in trouble and get transferred. So the job of the civil servant is not merely to be ethical. He has to be ethical and honest, but he has to deliver things on the ground. He has to perform, and hence he has to survive. Survival does not necessarily mean compromise. It can mean accommodation. I will do anything for my friend if it is not illegal. Why shouldn't I do everything for the politician if what he's asking is not illegal? So what we have to do is to look at what can be done and should be done. Why do we assume that whatever that politician, you know, in this film star, unfortunate thing is, there are two things unfortunate. One, everyone thinks that every bureaucrat is corrupt. And everyone thinks that every politician is wrong. Both are wrong. There are good, you know, I have named those politicians in my book. I had the pleasure of working with Mr. Kalyan Singh, one of the finest persons of politicians. I have the pleasure of working with Mallikarjun Kharge, pleasure of working with Mr. Prakash Javadekar. No, these are from different parties. And I don't name those officers in the book, but I've named officers who are downright idiotic, corrupt. I've not named them, but they are there. So there are all types that make this world. Give me a system where everything is fine. Like a human being, there's few shortcomings. So you have to, in life, you have to accommodate people. You can't have your way or the highway.
Thank you so much, sir. I think this is another lesson that I have taken back from this session, that one should always focus on the karma rather than focusing on the results. So I would now like to unmute Osmi. Nidhi, can you please help me with finding her name here and unmute her?
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. So my question to you is that in your book, Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant, you have discussed issues of moral conflicts in the minds of a civil servant especially the young new entrants. At such an early age of his or her professional life, how should an officer navigate between what is morally right and wrong, given that what might seem ethically and morally right to the officer might be at loggerheads with the ethical values of the higher authorities or even the public at times?
Best way of going about it is to consult somebody who you have trust in. Because initially that guidance would be required, because I ran into many dilemmas. If you, again, since you've read the book, I ran into dilemmas where I was not sure what needs to be done. In fact, at the end of some of the chapters, I've questioned my own conduct, because at that point in time, I didn't have too many. In one of the chapters, I lay importance on mentoring. I myself mentor hundreds of IAS officers. They're free to call me anytime. They can freely talk to me. And whatever little that I've collected in my life, I'm able to share with them. That helps them take a decision. It is wrong to expect that everyone will be able to do the right decision. But then if mentoring is there, if senior officers are available to them, I think it will be a good guidance to them. That's how I look at it.
Thank you, sir, for answering that question. Nidhi, you may ask your question next.
Yes, thank you, Bhumika Di. Good morning, sir, and thank you for such an insightful session and also an interesting one. So you have inspired me in a lot of ways. So I have a question for you. Like, we need to definitely make changes within ourselves, but IAS is a career where you have to look beyond yourself and you get into it with an aspect of serving the people as well. So, but I'm pretty confused, like there are so many problems to be dealt with, but then how do we, because it is not possible for an individual to, deal or pay equal attention to every problem existing in society. But then how can we pick and select our battles which we need to fight? And how did you do it in your experience?
Nidhi, whether it's life or official position, you have to prioritize. And that you learn through experience. Until such time, you can seek guidance from somebody. That there are so many tasks to be performed. You learn this art of prioritizing. And that's very important, because you can't attend to everything same time. You do that. I don't know what you plan in future. Suppose you want to appear in the civil service exam. You'll prioritize that these are the sets of activities that I have to do. Then you decide, this I'll do first, time remaining I'll do this, time remaining I'll do this. So it depends on how you prioritize, and prioritization comes through experience. And of course, in the beginning, you can seek guidance for it. But that's very important to prioritize, whether in life or in service. If you don't prioritize, you'll be in trouble. In fact, you'll end up doing things which are not important. You'll be wasting your time on that. So prioritization and focus. Second is, once you prioritize, focus. And one thing which, since you raised this issue, let me also, since I'm giving a lot of raya to you and advice to you, this is another thing. All of us need to change for the better. We try and attempt. How do you bring about that change in you? That's very important. At every stage of your life and career, you think that this is right, but you don't know how to go towards that. It's very important. And the best way of going about it is to associate that change with something which you like. And I'll give you my own example. I had taken law as one of my subjects, which I had not studied in the IAS. And I had to learn not many case studies. So someone told me, early morning is the best time to learn. But I was a late riser. Now, how do I change it? So what did I do was, I associated this change of habit with something which I am obsessed with, cricket. Now, India was traveling to Australia, and I'm talking of 1978, 79. They used to start their matches at 5:30 in the morning. Those days, we had only test matches. There was no telecast. Commentary used to come. So this match used to start at 5:30 in the morning. There were 5 test matches, 5 days test matches. 25 days, I woke up at 5:30 in the morning to listen to the commentary. Bingo, I started getting up early in the morning then. For youngsters like you, I would suggest, have a boyfriend who gets up early in the morning, ask him to ping you in the morning, you will jolly well get up. Find something which attracts you, change your habit. It's very important, because each one of us evolves. We have to make a conscious effort to change that habit. If you read this book by monk who sold this Ferrari, he talks about the 21-day rule. You have to fight with yourself for 21 days, but you can overcome them. Many people who've succeeded in life are those that have attempted and changed their habits.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering that question so well. Due to paucity of time, we'll only be taking one last question. Tanya, can you please unmute yourself? You have that option of unmuting.
Thank you, Bhumika Di. I hope I'm audible.
You are.
Yes, Tanya, you are.
First of all, thank you so much, sir, for such an inspiring session. I think that was one of the most comprehensive, profound, and intense sessions we could have with a civil servant of your stature. And as future bureaucrats, as aspiring bureaucrats, I think most of us were looking forward to have such an open and candid session with you. So, sir, my question to you is that when it comes to public policy, we have often seen that public policies relating to youth are often centered around the issue of employment, whereas in other sectors, say environment or maybe sustainable development or healthcare, the youth are usually left out as a distinct group. So, how do you think can we make it more inclusive to include other such sectors also vis-a-vis youth? And why does it happen that youth often gets singled out when it comes to these sectors?
First of all, I agree with you. I think youth should be involved in all policy formulation, not merely because that they get impacted by that policy, they may or may not get impacted, but on account of fresh ideas that come from them. The problem with the government which formulates policy is the manner in which it has to happen. What are the platforms through which such suggestions can be articulated? One is having an idea, the other is articulating that idea, and the third is receiving that idea, and fourth is processing that idea. All these steps will need to be worked out. So what now happens typically is that any policy is put on the portal and suggestions are invited from public at large. So one, of course, everyone can contribute to that, but having been a part of the government, it becomes difficult for a senior officer to go through all the suggestions. So how do you do it? Form into credible associations whose voices can be heard. And then, so for example, government will certainly read what FICCI has said. I'm so glad that CII has started its youth wing called Young Indians. Now, if that comes to that platform, that suggestion from Young Indians, then the chances are that they will be read in the government. So one is having that idea. The second is aggregating those ideas, then articulating those ideas, then presenting those ideas, then considering those ideas, then using those ideas. So you have to have a vehicle through which you can go through all that. It can be done, it should be done, but we'll have to look at the vehicles through which it can come. And by the way, before we conclude, since we are about to conclude, I'm tapping out my telephone number here, and I can be available to any one of you. You can message me here, and then I try and respond as Secretary Government of India. I used to do that within 24 hours. Now it's easier for me to do that. It will be a pleasure to hear from you, especially if any one of you reads the book. I'd love to have your feedback on that.
This is the biggest inspirational story, sir. A Secretary of India reachable through phone. It's
so generous of you, sir, to give you a phone.
Thank you so much, sir. Before I propose the formal vote of thanks, I would request everyone to please switch their videos on so that we can click a group screenshot. Nidhi, I would request you to please take the screenshot.
And can you send a copy to me as well?
Sure, sir, definitely.
As a souvenir?
Sure.
Definitely, sir, definitely.
Okay, so I request everyone to please switch on their videos.
You need to remove.
Bhumika, should I put it in the gallery mode now?
Yes, yes, sure, Nidhi.
Okay, so everyone ready? Smile. Done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. Thank you. Wholeheartedly, I would like to thank our esteemed speaker, Mr. Anil Swarup, sir, for spending his time and his efforts to interact with us on an issue of such pertinent importance. Thank you so much, sir, for explaining to us how youth, the Gen Z, can contribute in different capacities and ways to the public policy process. It was indeed a pleasure interacting with you. I would like to extend my warm regards to Dr. Vijayalakshmi Nanda ma'am, Acting Principal, Miranda House, for being our constant pillar of strength, optimism, motivation, hope, and whatnot. I'd also like to thank Dr. Namrata Singh ma'am, the teacher in charge, Department of Political Science, who has always been there as our mentor, a friend, and a guide. She also helped us bring this session to fruition. I'd also extend my regards and thanks to our faculty members for being there for us and motivating us throughout. I extend my thanks to Sandeep Anand sir for helping us with the logistics. Hoping to engage with an equally enthralling session on India's policy landscape, governance of challenges and opportunities with Dr. Aruna Sharma, Ms. Yamini Iyer, Dr. Kaushiki Sanyal ma'am in the later half of the day. Thank you everyone for joining us here and have a splendid day ahead.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
God bless you. Take care.
Thank you, sir.
For students, we'll be joining back again at 12. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Join back by 11:50.
I will be joining at 12, Namrata.